The presentation is the Native Americans of the French Creek Valley, and our presenter is Rebecca E. Knapp. Ms. Knapp recently joined the U.S. Forest Service as District Archaeologist for the Allegheny National Forest. Prior to joining the AMF, Ms. Knapp was the District 80 Archaeologist with PennDOT's Cultural Resource Management Program. She received her BA from Wilfrid Laurier University and her MA from the Memorial University of Newfoundland. She has extensive training and experience in historic and northeastern North American pre-contact and Arctic archaeology, and is currently undertaking further research in historic archaeology and the archaeology of our small-scale societies. Please, big welcome for Rebecca Knapp.
Thank you. First of all, I have to say that I have reduced the scope of my presentation a bit because in the amount of time that I have, addressing all the Native American populations living in the French Creek Valley area was simply too much. So I will just be talking about the Haudenosaunee today. So first of all, who are the Haudenosaunee? Most literally, it means people of the Longhouse, but you would be most familiar with them as either the Iroquois Confederacy, the Five Nations, or the Six Nations. They are 5 related nations, initially, that formed a confederacy approximately 1,000 years ago in what is now New York State. And bring up a map showing that. The initial 5 nations were the Seneca, Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, and Mohawk. In 1722, a 6th nation, the Tuscarora, also joined the Confederacy. By this time, the Haudenosaunee territory had expanded to include portions of southern Ontario, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, including the French Creek Valley area. The Haudenosaunee, in addition to being divided into 5 or 6 nations, were divided into clans. Each clan was named after an animal that was considered to have had special impact on the ancestors of that particular clan. And these clans were the basis of Haudenosaunee kin structure. Clans were your relatives. In fact, they were considered such close relatives, even the same clan in different nations, that you were traditionally not allowed to marry within your clan. You would be like marrying your sister or your brother. These clans were matrilineal and were run by the oldest woman in the clan, referred to as the clan mother. So before we can address the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, and the Haudenosaunee role in it, we have to track back a little bit more than a century to 1620, when the Mohawk first encountered the Dutch and began trading relations. Between 1620 and 1640, European diseases spread throughout the Haudenosaunee and ravaged the population. It is estimated that a minimum of 50% of the population was wiped out by disease alone during this period. Epidemics continued through the 1650s, 1660s, and 1670s, further dropping the population numbers. In response to these dramatic losses, the Haudenosaunee responded in a traditional way with mourning wars. Mourning wars had been conducted for centuries or millennia against related populations, not only by the Haudenosaunee, but the other related Iroquoian populations, the Wyandot, the Susquehannock, and so on. They would occur at the death of an individual, or rather after the mourning period ended for the death of an individual. There was ritualized mourning in Haudenosaunee society, and typically this would alleviate the grief associated with deaths. However, on occasion, a family would still be so grieved that the clan mother would call a mourning war. And at this time, the men of her clan would form a war party and attack one of the related groups, at which point they would take captives. The point of these raids was not death. In fact, death was the opposite of what they wanted to do. And also, there was not much economic gain. The sole reason for these wars was to gain captives, men, women, and children. Women and children would be adopted into the families. And as a result, the captives were treated very well. You didn't, after all, want to insult your future sister or son. But during the 1650s and 60s, due to the extreme loss of population, these mourning wars occurred on unprecedented scales. And in fact, the Haudenosaunee attacked and entirely or almost entirely absorbed the remaining populations of the Wyandot, the Erie, the Neutral, and the Kinnerhanen in the 1650s and the 1660s to attempt to supplement their own population losses. In addition, during this time, there were what came to be known as the Beaver Wars, in which the Haudenosaunee attacked typically their traditional enemies of the Algonquin, who had allied with the French, and formed small-scale raids against French fur traders as well, in an attempt to gain furs which they would then trade to the English in Albany. Due to both the mourning wars, which were now being conducted with firearms and thus increasing the previously very minimal death tolls, and the economic wars conducted against the Algonquian, the Haudenosaunee population had dropped again from 1640 to 1680 by another 25% or another 50% during that time, resulting in a population loss of approximately 75%, including adopted captives, over a 60-year period. If we remove the adopted captive numbers, which some members of the Jesuit, or some writers of the Jesuit relations, placed at 2/3 of Haudenosaunee villages by 1680, the population loss to disease and warfare was approximately 92% among the original Five Nations population. You would think that with a 92% population loss, the Haudenosaunee had reached the bottom of the slide. However, in 1775, between 1775 and 1780, things took a turn for the worse again. 1675. In 1674, a new governor was placed in Albany by the British. He, quite logically, thought that the best way to attack the French without actually attacking the French and causing another war would be to arm the Haudenosaunee and encourage them to attack the French in the British stead. Up until this point, all Haudenosaunee raids on the French had been rather small scale, and as a result, the French retaliation had also been on a small scale. However, with the British arming the Haudenosaunee and promising their military support, the Haudenosaunee attacked the French in force. And as a result of that, the French responded also in force with their more populous and better armed military. So, they burned numerous towns, particularly in Mohawk country, but also through other areas of the Haudenosaunee. Most of these villages were evacuated before the French arrived, due to scouts' warning of their incursion. But the Haudenosaunee were already a population on the edge. Losing multiple villages, having multiple fields being burnt, pushed them into a situation where people were dying of starvation and exposure, as well as warriors dying of, warfare with the French. And the French attacks were so vigorous that between 1689 and 1698, the Five Nations lost 25% of their remaining warriors in battle. As losses mounted and more villages burned, the Haudenosaunee sought assistance from the English. which did not materialize. Additionally, there were divides within the Haudenosaunee itself. Many of the captives that had been taken from the Wyandot and other northern groups had been converted to Catholicism by the French prior to their adoption into the Five Nations. And by this point, the French had sent some missionaries into traditional Five Nations territory and converted additional members to Catholicism. The Catholic members of the Haudenosaunee, therefore, were more inclined to support the French. And this support line, British traditionalists and Catholic French supporters, did not align with the clan structure. Therefore, there were divisions within clans themselves. Think of the American Civil War, brother fighting against brother in the North and the South, caused similar rifts within the Haudenosaunee. In an attempt to both stop the incredibly destructive wars and create peace within their clan structure, in 1699, the Haudenosaunee sent ambassadors both to the British in Albany and the French in Montreal. This resulted in 1701 with the Grand Settlement, which was a diplomatic coup for the Haudenosaunee. It established Five Nations neutrality in all future English-French conflicts and peace between them and both European nations. It also permitted trading, including during times of war, with both imperial powers. Furthermore, it established new territorial boundaries with an expansion of the traditional Haudenosaunee land into what at that time was considered Ohio, but would have included this portion of Pennsylvania. They also made peace with the French allied natives, who they had traditionally warred against for centuries before the European incursion. And it healed rifts between the Catholic French supporters and the traditionalist English supporters within the clan themselves. This new peace, the Grand Settlement, resulted in a period of renewal for the Haudenosaunee. Population losses settled for the first time since the Mohawk encountered the Europeans in 1620. There was only one major epidemic from 1700 to 1720, rather than multiple epidemics per decade. Economic warfares with the Algonquian ceased as trade routes were opened and additional hunting grounds in the Ohio Territory. And also warfare with the French, and the devastating results of that had stopped. In addition, the Haudenosaunee were gaining population through both traditional and unusual routes. In 1713, 1,500 Tuscarora migrated north from the Carolinas and asked to be adopted into the Five Nations. In 1722, this petition was granted, and the Tuscarora became the sixth nation. Also, while not formally adopted, the Seneca opened portions of the Ohio Territory, particularly in the French Creek Valley, to refugee populations from the Delaware, Shawnee, and other displaced groups. And finally, while warning wars may have ceased to the north and west, the Haudenosaunee were still conducting warning wars to the south on populations such as the Catawba in the Virginia and the Carolinas, who were not allied with either the British or the French. Throughout this period, there were several small wars between the British and the French that the Haudenosaunee remained neutral for. And in fact, during the 7 Years' War, or French and Indian War, the Haudenosaunee did remain neutral, officially. This neutrality allowed them to continue trading with both sides in the war for goods, including firearms. And it allowed their clan structures to, again, not be divided between the English and the French supporters. Though, they did not, the Haudenosaunee elders did not stop individuals within the clans from joining either side, which resulted in people from the same clans joining either the British Army or the French Army. The leaders, the clan mothers, generally quietly supported young men on either side who were attacking border forts that they saw as encroaching on their own territory. For example, support was quietly thrown behind attacks by the British on French forts in Ohio and behind the French for English forts in Appalachia, this area. The Senecas largely supported the English effort to remove French forts in the Ohio country, since that had been designated as Seneca land. But interestingly, throughout this entire period, the Haudenosaunee on either side of the war would attempt not to fight each other. They still saw themselves as one nation, simply on different sides of an international conflict. Typically, members would withdraw from battle before encountering another group of Haudenosaunee, or they would not join any conflict between the colonial powers that took place in traditional Six Nations territory, or would refuse to fight in battles in which they would have been forced to attack other members of the nations, or would send envoys to members on the other side of the colonial powers war to warn them of attacks prior to them occurring so that the members of that nation could withdraw. And finally, there were instances where members of the Haudenosaunee negotiated to allow other members on the opposite side of captured forts to be allowed to leave unmolested. Needless to say, with members of the Haudenosaunee effectively supporting both the British and the French, throughout the war, both the British and the French attempted to gain official Haudenosaunee support, which they never succeeded in doing. Initially, the English attempted threats to gain official support, and the French used bribes. Therefore, while official support remained lacking, they did have unofficial support. Initially to the French. Early in the war, a large army of French were allowed through Haudenosaunee territory, completely unmolested, and with the British unwarned so that they could have a surprise attack on British forces. However, this unofficial support for the French began to change in about 1757, when the French began to push into traditional Six Nations territory. At this point, larger numbers of Haudenosaunee began to join English forces, though they tended to stay at the back of the columns to preserve lives. Additionally, the Ohio Seneca, who had joined with the French to attack British forts in Appalachia, now did not care to assist the French from defending them from the now British attackers. Furthermore, in 1758, the British and the Haudenosaunee had the Treaty of Eton, which confirmed that the British confirmed that they did not plan on invading western Pennsylvania and the Ohio country, and that this was Six Nations territory. As a result, the Haudenosaunee felt that the Ohio territory was safe from further British incursion. By the end of the war, or toward the end of the war, at the assault by British forces on the French fort of Niagara, 900 warriors from the Haudenosaunee joined. During the siege, they called a ceasefire and negotiated with the French and the British for the release of all the French allied Haudenosaunee within the fort. And during this siege, the French allied Senecas were permitted to leave. To ensure that they remained unmolested, a large segment of the 900 warriors left with them. But enough remained that they were able to assist in the siege of the fort and obtain 96 captives to bring back to Six Nations land after it fell. And finally, during the very last days of the war, when the British advanced on Canada, including the mission settlements in which some Haudenosaunee Catholics had settled, the Six Nations sent a large group of men, women, and children to negotiate a neutrality between the mission Haudenosaunee and the English, provided that the mission Haudenosaunee ceased their active support of the French. These mission settlements maintained their own lands and did not undergo retribution for French support. So to conclude, the whole Haudenosaunee method of neutrality, or fighting while not fighting, in the French and Indian War was to minimize both internal strife between the French and the English supporters, and to maintain a stable population, minimizing loss of life. Haudenosaunee did not fight against Haudenosaunee, and Haudenosaunee attempted to maintain their numbers. This resulted in, at the end of the French and Indian War, Haudenosaunee Nation in a good position. They were allied with the winners, or at least, even if they were officially neutral, the British saw them as allied since they had had so much effort toward the end of the war on the British side, and their population had not been decimated by either retribution against French supporters from British or the actual war. All right. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
The 92 captives, what was the nature of those captives and what happened to them?
I was not able to find whether they were French captives or native captives. I suspect that they were probably French allied natives. And assuming that they were all men, they would have been taken back to a Six Nations settlement or multiple Six Nations settlements. And the clan mothers would have decided whether they were to be adopted into the Six Nations or whether they were to be ritually tortured and murdered. Yes?
You use the dividing line within the various clans of people who were under the influence of the Catholic missionaries versus those who had traditionally traded with the British. Is that really a simplification, and were there some other major...
It's definitely a simplification.
Was it more geography or trade routes that tended to make the various tribes or clans ally one way or another, or was it more who was winning in their neck of the woods?
Probably a big chunk of it was who was winning in their neck of the woods. There were some geographical influences. You know, if you were close to the French missions, you would probably be more likely to have allied with the French versus the British if you were closer to Albany. And it is also a simplification to say that, you know, the traditionalists allied with the British. There were also Protestant missionaries in this time. They weren't as successful as the Catholic missionaries, but they did have success among the Haudenosaunee, and there were also Protestant Haudenosaunee who supported the British.
How would you define the Mingo today? The Mingo, how would you define them?
I'm afraid that's not a topic that I know enough about to put out a theory.
I think they were just Iroquois that were in the Ohio country. They were somewhat, what's the word I want to say? They were somewhat independent of the main Seneca body and other Iroquois nations. I've always wondered that too, but that's sort of what I've
I always
read.
wondered if they were left over maybe Eries and other...
That's a hypothesis too.
but no.
There's
no
another
one's
group
ever-
of black Maitwoods that might have been the Eries, but who knows?
I haven't been able to figure it out myself either. Good point.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Do you have any estimate of the population numbers before 1620?
The population numbers before 1620 are really vague, but we were probably looking at tens of thousands of individuals. Yeah, typically the population numbers traditionally have been estimated in archaeological circles as relatively low, because by the time the imperialist forces got there, rather than just a few scattered traders, villages were, maybe only 1,000 people, maybe. But recently, as we've been doing further analysis of populations, both of graves, and we're also doing further excavations on settlements, the population numbers have increased, well, the proposed population numbers, which is now why 50 to 90% is considered the standard for mortality from initial European diseases, even prior to heavy European contact. Simply because what we're seeing is suggesting much larger populations than were there by the time the French or the British colonial forces got into the area.
But when you say that, is that 10,000 or 50,000 or 100,000 or a million?
Yes.
Yeah, I wish I could give you a good answer, but the answer depends on who you read and largely falls into we're not entirely sure.
The Hurons, which were a bigger tribe than the Iroquois, were 40,000, and that was counted by the Jesuit missionaries going village to village to village, taking a census before they started to die off from the diseases.
Right.
So that the maximum the Iroquois could have been was 20,000,
Right.
and more likely 10 to 12.
Right.
800 warriors for four tribes.
That helps.
Yes?
Can you comment in any more detail on the Catholic, the proselytizing Catholics? How did that work and how successful was it? And did the English try to do something similar? Did they, care for the souls of the Indians like the French did?
The Catholic, saying whether it was successful or not, yes, it was. Catholic conversion was successful, and as it's noted, the Jesuits were really the first French to come into Wyandot territory, the Huron territory, and they had quite good luck among the Huron of conversion. They had less luck among the five nations at that time, and later 6 nations, but they did have some luck. The British and the general Protestant various forces, they also sent missionaries, but generally speaking, the organization of the Protestant missionaries was considerably less than the organization of the Catholic missionaries. The Jesuits were out there on the very frontier, going into settlements. Generally, the Protestant missionaries tended to come after contact had already been made with the British. The British had settled an area, and then the missionaries would go out for some related tribes. But as a result, they didn't have the success that the Catholic missionaries did. They had some success, but not limited.
How do you learn these things? Who wrote down what you read?
Well, I did a fair bit of research directly related to the French and Indian War right before writing this report. And I saw various articles going back in scholarly journals from the 1950s, even earlier. There were some from the 1920s, all the way through the early 2000s. So I tried to read a selection of those to try to better inform myself on the events.
Were they Jesuits who wrote things down?
They're in the very earliest written records, or records written in a language that the French, the English could read. Yes, it was generally the Jesuits. The Jesuit relations are like the handbook for particularly French and Huron or Haudenosaunee contact.
Just as a side note on that question, you go on the internet if you use the computer service. The entire 73 volumes of the Jesuit Relations are online. And if you were to put them physically together, they would form a bookshelf like that. And so some of you information, if you're interested.
Do I look like I know how to
Yep, depending on the quality of your local libraries, you may also be able to get them through interlibrary loan. But yes, the Jesuits, most or all of the Jesuit missionaries wrote down what they saw, and that's why the volumes are so large. There is a huge amount of information contained in the Jesuit Relations.
What were the totals again for the percentage that died from diseases and the percentage from warfare?
The conservative estimate in prior to 1640 is that between 1620 and 1640, about 50% of the population died from disease. After 1640, the numbers that died from disease versus warfare become a lot more confused, simply because there was so much more warfare and so much deadlier warfare due to the advent of firearms versus a bow and arrow. Most of the numbers I have for specific warfare deaths date later to either the late 17th century or during the French and Indian War. For example, with the conflict with the French, we know that the Five Nations, or at least the Mohawk, and it's assumed that the rest of the Five Nations were similar, the wars dropped the warrior population by 25%. Okay.
I just want to say there's a book out called The Ambiguous Iroquois Empire. This was a time period where the French were trying to create empire and the British were trying to create empire. And this book talks about the ambiguous Iroquois Empire, and it's a lot about the same time period with the Beaver Wars and how they dominated, and all the other tribes paid tribute to them. So they were always the people that negotiated.
Mm-hmm. And they held a very, for that time, it was a very large area. Southern Pennsylvania, South Central Pennsylvania, up through Western Pennsylvania, into Ohio, essentially all of New York State, except a slim piece held by the British, and up into Southern Ontario. So yes, it was a very significant chunk of land that was held by the Haudenosaunee.
But it's a little easier reading than trying to go back and read some of this.
Yes.
It's
something that's puzzling about the Trans-Appalachian area in regards to the late prehistoric populations is that so many of them became extinct, or at least did not survive as ethnic groups into the contact period. I'm thinking of the southwestern Pennsylvania Monongahela people, our northwestern Pennsylvania McFate culture folks, Little Sea of Ohio. Is there any suggestion through your research that disease may have preceded even the 1720s spread and perhaps got over the mountains even earlier than that?
Yes. The traditional archaeological thought process was that the Haudenosaunee had attacked and destroyed individual culture populations and then absorbed the captives of those groups. And to be fair, that almost certainly happened. But as the disease vectors are traced on through, typically disease preceded European entrance into an area, sometimes by decades. You would have the Mohawk in contact with the Dutch in 1620. Well, Mohawks traders would gather European goods, and they would go on to another group and trade unknowingly bringing these diseases along with them, either in the goods themselves or as vectors. You know, a person would encounter somebody who was contagious with smallpox during the trade. They would have 2 weeks or so before they would begin feeling ill. They would go back to their village. Maybe they would even go on to another village further than that. And it just kept going like that. So it does appear that disease had worked its way further into the interior well before there was actual European contact. And one of the hypotheses now says that these groups were possibly weakened by European diseases, and that encouraged the Haudenosaunee conquest. Yes.
Could you speak to the languages that the Haudenosaunee used with the people around them? There were other Iroquoian groups, you mentioned the Wyandots. How did they communicate with the Tuscarora?
Well, the Tuscarora were an Iroquoian group. There were Iroquoian groups scattered from Ontario down to the Carolinas. And they all spoke either the different dialects of the same language or similar related language, say, you know, Dutch to German. So generally, people could understand each other, at least largely. And also there were a number of traders who went between these. So you would have people who were multilingual. I imagine it got a lot more complicated when they began to adopt captives from completely unrelated groups, whether they would be the more widely known in America, the English captives, or completely unrelated Native American groups, because there the people wouldn't speak any of the same languages except for a few traders or diplomats. Okay.